Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we will discuss on climate change. Especially we do focus on global climate leaders. We have our world famous speaker, Mr. Robin Lee and Mr. Daniel. Before starting this dialogue, I just want to share some good news that World Talent Economy Forum. We are collaborating with South Asian largest business incubation. It's in Chittagong. It's called Chuet Business Incubations. Why I'm bringing these issues to this topic because we are discussing about leadership. So there are a lot of leaders, engineers, government agency, corporations, academy, everybody working together. And our World Talent Economy Forum, we are actually helping them to grow this ecosystem. We meet with the vice chancellor of these universities. Uh, uh, Beside that, we are closely working with the directors. Where these are the students, those who develop startup, many interesting startup. Our honorable Prime Minister actually uh, investing huge amount of money for developing these business incubations, and World Talent Economy Forum helping these trade business incubations to solve many problems in South Asia. So those who are interested to join in our ecosystem uh, as it mentors, as an investors, as an techno entrepreneurs, they can join. Beside that, if you want to involve in this ecosystem, you want to bring your startup in South Asia, you can directly come and join with us in these incubations. So we are actually working with hundreds of universities, millions of youth, and all of the policymaker, government agency, and corporations. They are joining very fast in our ecosystem. We are launching another largest startup uh, conference. I think coming 2 months, our ministers and the prime ministers, everybody will join, and hopefully your contributions for today's dialogue and all of the dialogue will be helpful for uplifting this ecosystem. And this way, we can develop better leaders, and maybe there will be the climate change leaders. So, Professor Rob, you have a lot of contribution for World Talent Economy Forum. From day one, you are contributing for us. I want to give you a special salute for your contributions. So, what you want to discuss for today's session?
Sure. So, climate leader. So the when anytime a country or a company or anybody else decides to be a leader in something, they think it means doing something first. And really, that's not what a leader is. A leader has followers, so it doesn't do you a lot of good to be doing something that's very different. Um, it, in terms of being a leader, what makes you a leader is, well, to give you an example, in smartphones, um, Apple came out with the iPhone, and long before they were the dominant player in the segment, they got BlackBerry, Palm, Nokia to chase them with the form factor. So they were a leader before they were dominant. And so leadership really means not just doing something aggressively. It means also getting at least some people to follow you. That's leadership. Leadership is predicated on the fact that you've got followers. And I think we miss that up sometimes. And so right now, with regard to climate change, being a leader in climate change and at least reversing climate change requires efforts at a global level. And so at least with regard to reversal, leadership could be very difficult. At least to make with regard to making meaningful progress. However, if for instance you're able to convince all the other nations to follow your particular prescribed method, then you would in fact be a leader. If everybody on the planet decided to go to, for instance, to electric cars, and you were the one that had initiated that particular effort, I think you probably argue the EU was probably the leader there. Then you'd be a leader even if you didn't make material progress, only because everybody else is chasing you. Now, where we are with climate change is more in terms of mitigation right now. What do you do to mitigate the impact of climate change? Here in the United States, we're experiencing a number of extreme climate events, from forest fires, extreme temperatures. And I expect a lot of you and the rest of the world are experiencing some of the same. Leadership might be predicated on coming up with structures that can survive these climate events, and then propagating out whatever technology that you developed so that others used it and followed your lead in terms of mitigation. It might be 3D built houses, it might be carbon capture, it might be any one of a number of things, but it does predicate you bringing others on board and having them follow you for meaningful change. I'm not sure that makes a lot of sense, only because of reach, for an emerging economy to try to do. And the reason I point that out is it's a matter of reach and power. If to get people to follow you, you need a couple of things to be evident. First, they've got to see you as someone that's doing something they want to see done, and that means reach. And so for a smaller country to do that, that would require marketing, global marketing. It would require or outreach, or at least some kind of effort to use some form of social media or advanced marketing techniques to try to do this with a low budget. Doesn't seem to be likely to me that a small emerging economy is going to be able to do that. It's possible, but it just doesn't seem to be likely. It's a reach. What you could do, however, is to create the potential for leadership, is become an example for the rest of the world on how to do things. You've got a number of problems the country is facing: agriculture, human safety, providing clean water, that kind of thing that falls underneath the auspices of mitigating climate change damage. And if you were able to showcase you could do it better, cheaper, and at a larger scale than anybody else, it would be foolish for other countries to not to follow that position, and therefore establish you as a leader, at least in that particular segment. And so that's probably where I would suggest the leadership be focused, is trying to create a definitive example of how to do something, how to mitigate climate change, not necessarily how to fix it, because the scale of having to fix it is just too great, but mitigate climate change that is in itself effective, cost effective, efficient, and popular with your population, and then use that to drive to at least influence and convince other geographies to follow. So that's kind of where I would think you'd focus. Mitigation right now, unless there's something unique about what it is that you've got within the country. But mitigation would probably be the best approach, and then showcase that your method is. And by the way, that there are some advantages when you're in an emerging economy to doing it this way. But in developed countries, they tend to cheat a bit because we've got so much surplus in terms of resources and capabilities. We often aren't very efficient in the mechanisms that we use. In an emerging economy, you have to be efficient because you don't have unlimited resources. Well, not that anybody does, but you have hard limits on the resources, and so invariably, your methods should be more efficient than those can be more efficient than those coming from a developed country, because of the very nature of the problem you're trying to solve. An example would be, I believe it was South Africa, that was having trouble with the prenatal care. This isn't in climate change, but something else, prenatal care, and they needed prenatal monitors. And so and typically prenatal monitors are costs in excess of, I think, around 20 grand each, and they're clearly unaffordable. And they were able to bring up a company that was able to do prenatal monitors for under $100. They were effective. And so that if they'd been able to broadcast that out, that might have changed a good chunk of the cost globally in the medical community. Sadly, it's kind of state and region, but it showcases that there are advantages to operating in an area with limited resources, because it forces a level of creativity that is not being forced in more developed economies. And so that's where I think you could have or showcase leadership. How can you do something that's going to be critical as we mitigate the damage from climate change, that is scalable, that is cost effective, and that can be done on a global basis, both in emerging and developed economies? I think that would be where I would suggest focusing. I'll pass over to the Reverend Dan.
Oh, it's my turn. Hey, important topic as usual. Rob, I like the way you split it up into talking about leadership as well as the climate issue. Some people have jokingly just politics, find it and then getting out in front of it. A lot of elections, so-called leaders sometimes don't have actual missions and missions. They just want to do whatever the focus group is telling them that week, or when that are telling them that. And this is the wrong kind of leadership to have. A real has a lot of great aspects. Like he won't do something. He won't ask his team to do something that he wouldn't do personally, and that's the kind of bottom line of leadership in my book is leading from within the group, the organization, not being apart from it, but being part of it. And we all are part of this human organization on Spaceship Earth, and we haven't, it seems, gotten our leadership techniques nailed down, but we're working on it. I mean, we have a lot of good potential to refine it, and I'm trying to come up with an initiative that I think I'm getting close to for the Tom Ross, Dan Tweed Transhumanist Party campaign. Tom said, "Hey, could you take all your ideas and kind of put them under the humanity, and I'll cover the AI and the ET initiatives." So I'm thinking, how can I do that? I think what's lacking in humanity is reciprocal accountability. It's a phrase I keep going back to, but really science and democracy and really all progress has to have this dynamic of reciprocal. That means back and forth, and accountability. That means you can do what you say you're going to do, and you can prove that you're doing what you say you did. And this is kind of a law of cybernetics that says communication is only possible between equals. When you take someone and put hierarchy, there's an unfortunate effect where the below them will start just telling them what they think the guy above them wants to hear, and this has the effect that people higher up in dominance hierarchies tend to get dumber and dumber because they're being fed all this sycophantic yes man information from below. You might say that a guy like Vladimir Putin is a perfect example of a leader who's been continually fed what his underlings think he wants to hear. So how do you counter an offense? Well, reciprocal accountability, transparency. I love David Brin's thoughts and books on this. He wrote a book called The Transparent Society, which solves the problem of too much surveillance, top-down surveillance, by flipping it around and having bottom-up surveillance to keep it. Again, there's that reciprocal accountability kind of engine. So why are we trying to lead really large groups that are kind of unwieldy? There's a number I've talked about before. Again, the Dunbar number, which is the average person can only form close, trusted bonds with about 150 people during their life. But when you're young, you think you're going to live forever. You don't think about things like, how big of a trusted tribe am I going to end up in? But this number has kind of been borne out in some of neighborhood organizations. There's a system called local exchange trading system, and that's they found that 150 people in the group is kind of the sweet spot where everyone can get to know each other. They have potlucks maybe once a month, and people come. But that's a maximum size number. And one of the things that they notice is this is about as many people as come to a funeral that say they knew the person. So that's one source of this Dunbar number. By the way, it's named after an anthropologist, Robin Dunbar, Oxford University researcher, was researching primates, and we are primates actually too. So the number kind of applies. So yeah, I think by building these smaller Dunbar-sized tribes of trust, and everyone's going to have there's 8 billion people on the planet, so there's 8 billion potential Dunbar tribes, but there's a lot of the membership. So can we create systems that will sort of identify these tribes and where they are, and you should meet him, or you should know this person, and I think we can start to have like information driven supplements to this Dunbar tribe, like apps that will find the missing handshakes. That old line that we're all 6 handshakes from anyone on the street, or as someone joked, you're 6 handshakes from Kevin Bacon. Someone knows someone who knows someone, and then do that 6 times, and you're shaking hands with Kevin Bacon. But it's also of this Dunbar effect tribe number. So I think what we need is a humane reciprocal accountability, and I think it's going to look something like the global amateur radio hobby, which is about 3 million people that pass tests and get technology to where they can communicate with each other off the grid. And you'll find that those people in that community are, they don't tolerate a lot of BS, but they are very helpful, and they tend to be pretty savvy and, about what they talk about. They, in like, it's like you can't break Ohm's law. My electronic used to say he'd hear something blow up in the corner of the classroom, and he'd announce loudly, "You can't break Ohm's law." It's like, the speed of light. It's not just a good idea. It's the law, 186,262 miles per second instead of just 55 miles per hour. It's not just a good idea. It's the law. So a level playing rule order. This is what creates a framework to have these kind of reciprocal accountability unions and tribes. And it's time to talk about upgrading human rights to humane rights, because we're not the only actors on the act. We're not stakeholders. There's a closed life support system going on here, and unable to duplicate. And until we know how to duplicate, we better stop destroying it. So let's all be leaders at the local level and be data rich and reciprocally accountable leaders. So pass the mic there. Thanks again.
No problem at all. I'll pick up the mic and everything. A couple of things that I was going to observe and everything in the conversation from both Rob and Reverend Daniel. One is, I do remember a certain website that used to exist many years ago, and I'm actually about to date myself. Rob will enjoy this and everything, but it used to be called 6 Degrees of Separation. It was actually an early version of like a Facebook or an Instagram, and unfortunately it went the way of the dodo bird, because it was definitely a website that was built on the model that you were just talking about, which is that we are all 6 degrees away from whatever famous person or connection that we want to have. So if you wanted to meet President Biden, you probably know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody that can eventually get to President Biden. And that was kind of the notion of what he was talking about. And I do believe in local community, and even those community groups that you were talking about. As a matter of fact, in the day after tomorrow, I'll be hanging out with one of those local community groups that is a creative group, because I will be working with our local poetry slam team as they are doing an event at the Cultural Arts Center that I work at, and that is part of what they talk about, because sometimes the creative arts can be used to even bring light to some of these issues, including issues on climate and all in that space. So sometimes our creatives can be some of those that will answer the call to come up with solutions and all in that space. There are many a case of a famous scientist or a famous person that has come up with solutions that also had a artistic background as well. And sometimes, the notion of how we find these solutions is oftentimes based on critical thinking, and the arts can help us develop that critical thinking and all along those lines. I don't know all of the great scientists that were also musicians, but I know that there were a number of them that were out there, whether that was Einstein, who I think had some entertainment and cultural value as well. And I know that George Washington Carver, who came up with all kinds of solutions with the peanut, also probably had some creative aspects of his life. Even just finding all those uses for the peanut was amazing as well. And he did that way back in like the 18th century or in that kind of space, if I remember my time frame, and all along those lines. I was also going to take a different bend to what we're saying, because one of the things that I get frustrated by, and I love to hear both Reverend Daniel and Rob's thoughts about this, is that a lot of times we get into these notions of things that we can do to change the environment, to make the environment better. They become kind of the fad of the day. I could literally find a bucket. I was using it earlier, ironically, to transport some water instead of its original purpose, and all in that space. But it was the bucket that was given to me to do composting, and that was a fad that was very much in a lot of people's houses and in a lot of people's area. And I don't know that it is as much of a fad as it probably should be, because there is a lot of waste that is out there that can be used to till a garden or to create a urban garden or a number of other things along those lines. And I don't know that it is as popular as it used to be, because it was kind of a fad of the day, and it's had a couple of iterations where it's been a fad. It was definitely a fad in the 60s. I would argue a couple of times in the 2000s it became a fad as well, as kind of like urban gardening, and has become a fad as well. But I sometimes get frustrated because it becomes like that fad of the day, and we don't necessarily pass the fad on to the next generations, or even get the folks involved or staying involved, and all along those lines. So that is something that is something that, as we think of being a leader, we need to figure out ways to make it not just a fad, but a trend. And a trend is something that lasts a little bit longer than a fad, and is definitely has some duration and all in that space along those lines. I'm also a fan of radical change and all in that space. So some people may not be as much of a fan, but I am a fan of people that will take the issue to the people and sometimes do it in a radical way. And even though he is passed, and I'm not saying that he was always doing things that were the greatest in the world, but sometimes you got to do some radical things in order to get people's attention and all along those lines. So I do remember being a fan, and at one time I had the book, I may still have the book laying around here at some point or another, of Ecotage. And Ecotage was this notion, and it was a radical leader named the Fox, or at least that was his nickname, but he would literally find people that were polluting and causing other harms to the environment, and would bring that attention to them. Y'all were talking earlier about the animals, and I personally think that the reason that the orcas and the sharks and other people are doing their attacks is because they're tired of us messing with them, so they figure they mess back with us. And that's just my thoughts on that. People can either choose to agree or disagree, but I do know that the fox, when he was living, and I think he has been passed many years ago, would literally find the dead fish that had been polluted in the Midwest, grab that dead fish that had been killed because of the pollution and the sludge, get those dead fish and some of the other things, and literally sneak into the corporate offices and leave that very smelly mess on the doors of those leaders. So that definitely got their attention, and that's just one tactic that I am aware of, and all along those lines. But that's just some of my thoughts about radical leadership, and sometimes you got to do some radical things in order to get people's attention and all in that space. But that's just my thoughts, and I don't know if I see that David has joined us as well, but I don't know if Rob or Reverend Daniel, before I turn the mic over to David, have any thoughts about how too often we get caught up in the trends and we don't maintain the trends, and also about radical leadership. But that's just some of my immediate thoughts.
Well, a quick comment on the composting fad is that it did lead to cities providing green waste containers with the garbage. So it turned out to be more practical to kind of aggregate all that organic material in a big facility where you could really compost it, teeming acres and acres. But yeah, go on to our.
I don't know if Rob's got anything to add before I toss it back to David, but even there are so many corporations that say they will do recycling, and then they don't necessarily do the recycling, or they throw the plastic in the wrong containers, or they don't necessarily follow the rules of how the recycling should be done, and how many of those containers are actually being used to dump garbage instead of the plastic and the other recycled items that they should be used at. I know even the Cultural Arts Center that I work at, we just recently switched for exactly that reason, because we had a trash container. Actually, technically, the trash container is still there because they haven't moved it yet, but it's one of those big dumpsters. And now we have replaced it with the two dumpsters that are for the two separate items. So one is for garbage and the other is for recycling. But even in the recycling movement, I don't think that enough of us do it, and that enough of us pay as much attention to it until there are maybe events. Because I was just at a festival 2 weeks ago, and they definitely made sure that you separated your recyclables from your non-recyclables. And I think it's the Eno Festival is 97% trash free, and that is something that they pride themselves on as part of that festival that draws in tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, and all along those lines. So I wish more people would do that, whether it was personally or on festivals or on bigger events. But that's just my own personal thoughts. But I do know that the Eno prides itself on that, and it's prided itself on that for a number of years. The fact that they are about 97% trash free.
Well, our trash
Thank
trucks
you.
have a camera, and they will actually fine you if they see the wrong stuff coming out of the wrong container. So I think it's pretty successful. But go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. David Smith. Mr. David Smith.
Well, Sharif, thank you. And Mark, I agree with a lot of what you're saying there. And Daniel, here in Austin, we have a 4 trash bin pickup. And it's kind of interesting. One of them is one that is for food scraps, mostly only. And I love that one because you can always, when it begins to get anywhere full, I can go out and count raccoons and possums and foxes and things like that around it. And if they would let me shoot in the city limits, I could have a pretty good time out there as a hunter with that. But no, this topic is so interesting to me. Last week, I took some time off and went on a 5-day cruise. And to me, it was interesting that on a cruise ship that you almost think should be able to work as a climate really good example because it's such a self-contained ecosystem. Really did not have any type of recycling on board. Really did not do things that demonstrated much outside of it. Yes, they're doing things to begin to control some of their emissions because their licenses are mandating that. But it was one of those instances where I sat there and went, boy, you could be doing this, you could be doing that, you could be doing this, and in very simple ways. When we were on the decks with the pools and the water activities and things where they weren't using glass and everything was plastic, yet there was no recycling of any of that. And most of us kind of walked around and going, God, we feel bad throwing it all in one container with everything else. So you have those opportunities here. And Mark, I agree with you on the other thing. It took me a little bit of time to get into the city recycling. And my neighborhood in Austin was actually one of the first to do it. So we got to pilot the food scratch recycling. And that was an interesting pilot because you would look down the street and you see about one of every 5 houses maybe putting that bin out sometimes, and the others just kind of sit there. So it's an evolving process, and leadership is so important to that. And like many things we talk about on Sharif's programs, the strong requirement to educate the common citizens, to educate everyone in the benefits, not just the benefits of doing it, but what the issues are that are trying to be solved by us doing it, and understand the impacts of those. So it's one that is kind of near to us, but we see it, particularly traveling internationally, really not implemented very well on a widespread basis. So, Mark, maybe you can become our champion and begin to put programs in place that can be taken globally to help understand the importance of doing this type of things you were talking about. So, Sharif, thank you for letting me be here.
No doubt about that. Because one of the things that I was trying to remember, because there was a movie that actually was in one of the developing countries, and I remember seeing this movie years ago, and they actually managed to turn some of their garbage into art. But I know that Sharif, we have had some of your listeners and some of your students that are actually from the country of Brazil, and I've actually mentioned at one of my urban gardening acquaintances and friends is a young lady from Brazil, but I know that Brazil has had its own issues with garbage and recycling and all along those lines. It is a continuing problem there in that part of the world. It's a part of the world that I would like to visit. I'm glad you got to go on that cruise. But I've heard great things about Brazil, but I've also heard some negative things. And one of the negative things is the fact of their trash collection and their waste collections, because apparently most municipalities in Brazil, and I know we've had panelists as well as folks that have listened, and if they want to correct me, then please do so. But I heard that as recently as last year, 2022, there were an estimated 800,000 trash recyclers there in Brazil that only collected 90% of Brazil's recycled material, and that they were trying to work on their recycling rate, because apparently their recycling rate in that part of the world is only a mere 4%. So 4% is being recycled out of the many things that are going on there. And they say that Brazil, and that is a relatively decent sized country, generates something like 72 million tons of solid waste every year. And that has been actually climbing up since 2017. So that is a case where there is a need to address the issue. And I'm just using Brazil as an example. I'm sure there are other third world and second world countries that face this problem as well. But if there are listeners from Brazil, and I know you've had them in the past, that want to talk about some of the things that they are doing to address the issue, because like I said, it was probably almost a decade ago that I saw that particular movie, and we're talking about the folks that would pick through the trash. I think there were some things around the art that was done, and it might have been even more than one movie that I saw that dealt with Brazil and its trash dumps, because apparently they have large garbage dumps there in that area and all in that space. But y'all all are more world travelers than I am. I need to get out in my world travels more. But does anybody have any thoughts about what is going on, particularly in Brazil, but even in Latin America? I brought up some of the things that I have heard about.
Mark, Brazil is an interesting country. I've been there probably 30 times, maybe 30 times plus. And there's parts of Brazil where they do excellent. There's parts where it's not. It's just because as you look at it, Brazil is still a developing nation. And there's a wide range of gaps between the different social economic levels in Brazil. And yes, at the lower social economic levels, there's not a lot of recycling. And there's a lot of waste that is just discarded wherever they are. But as you begin to go across the social economic, and particularly in some of the cities like in Sao Paulo and Curitiba and San Jose de Campos and others, Curitiba is the Silicon Valley of Brazil. And very, very advanced there, very advanced climate information, very advanced recycling. Then you have others like the slums in Sao Paulo on the way to the airport, where are just shanty towns, and there's none there. So it's the same problem you have as you travel other places. I've been to places in Asia that are totally the same. And part of it's that education that we talked about. And how can you get the education put in place across all the social economic levels? Is part of my answer to your question.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Hey, Reverend Daniel, just really quickly, I know that whether we're talking about trash in Brazil or trash in a number of other places, one of the things that I know the Maker Society does a really good job of, and my dad has done it as well. I mentioned that on a couple of other shows in the past, and he is still very active in the art world. But a lot of people are finding that one man's trash is another man's treasure. So there are a lot of people that are doing some things even in the trash space in order to create some amazing things, and whether that is art or whether that is practical things like desk and other things that they can find from the material that might be in the garbage and all along those lines. And to even what David was talking about, I know that there were some sports facilities here in the United States, and I imagine we'd even do the same with some of the soccer matches around the world. And maybe they are even doing with that with some of the soccer matches and rugby matches and cricket matches around the world, where there is so much waste of the food that some of that waste could be returned back to those that are in the poverty lane and don't have the adequate food, because I know that that was a program that existed in, I want to say, New York was one of the New York sports teams, and had been picked up by other teams as well. And I don't see why soccer teams and others couldn't do that. But I know you're in that maker space. So what are your thoughts about both using recycled food to help our poor, which would be a climate issue, as well as maybe finding some of the treasures that we might have in that garbage that is being tossed away that might not be as much of the garbage as we think it is?
It's called upcycling. It's actually not upcycling, but it's taking something that's already in a finished form and repurposing it. And makerspace people are very good at doing this. You might remember the little Altoid tin challenge. You remember the little mints that come in the tin? Well, makers have used these Altoid tins like for clever projects that can fit in there. But yeah, waste. The zero waste philosophy is there is no waste. Waste is something we call waste. Is just a resource that's out of place. You know, every atom on the periodic table, I guarantee you, is not waste. And you know, enough energy we can disassemble so-called out-of-place resources if we use down to their computer even. So yeah, it's kind of like the concept of infinity. You know, as long as we're never going to stop chasing it, even though it may not exist anywhere in reality. It's a mental concept, and waste is a mental concept. So thanks for throwing me that ball. I appreciated it.
I'll throw one to Rob then, since I'm throwing balls around and everything. But Rob, I earlier mentioned the thing about radical concepts and all in that space. But do you think that we need more radical leaders that are willing to do radical things? I mentioned the Fox, and like I said, he was clearly breaking the law in some ways, and in a lot of ways he's breaking the law because he was breaking into places and all in that space. But do you think that we sometimes need radical leadership even in the climate conversation? I mean, I even think about like what was going on with Greenpeace and the whales, but I was just wondering your thoughts about radical leadership.
Well, it really depends on whether the radical leadership is focused on the problem or they're just trying to create a business opportunity for themselves. Often with regard to Greenpeace probably comes to mind because my history with Greenpeace isn't particularly good. My recollection was Greenpeace was going after a number of companies that I worked with, not because they were being particularly ungreen, they were in line with everybody else, but because they had excess cash and Greenpeace wanted the donations. And so it really depends on how applied the radical leadership is. Anytime it's like talking about heroes. Nobody really, a successful military should have no heroes. A hero is somebody that steps in, breaks convention, and does something that nobody else could or should do. If you're doing everything else right, you don't need a hero. If you're doing a lot of stuff wrong, then yeah, you kind of do. Well, with climate change, we're doing a lot of stuff wrong, and so having some level of radical pushback probably does make a certain amount of sense, only because it at the very least it wakes people up to the problem and the fact that some aspect of the problem is being played down or covered up. Our fight with large petrochemical companies goes way back to the 1920s, when much of the research about how bad that it was going to be for the environment was concealed or destroyed. And we could have easily made the pivot back then, because back at the beginning of the automotive age, we had steam, electricity, and gas, and gas won. Gas shouldn't have won, and we know that now. We should have known that back then, and there were enough studies to indicate that this was going to be a serious problem to showcase that we really should have known this back then. Having said that, sometimes when you've got industries controlling the narrative or particular political parties controlling the narrative, and that narrative is negative for the environment, negative for the species, then sometimes it takes unfortunately it takes a hero, it takes a radical leader, whatever you want to call them, to step in and attempt to mitigate, because they have to fight upstream against what people believe the truth is, even though it's a false belief. I think we're kind of in the midst of that now. We do have clearly radical folks on the side of climate change. Some of them probably do more harm than good because they're scary. Others bring attention to the problem and are able to get a certain amount of support to address it. Though long term, really do need to fix the misinformation problem that governs all of this. If everybody agrees the problem is dire, then it's far easier to mitigate it than if we're fighting upstream with large numbers of people that don't believe that the problem is dire, and it's a figment of somebody else's imagination, and that somebody else is going to make money off the deal. So that's kind of where we lie. But yeah, to your point, given the huge efforts to provide misinformation, a little bit of radical counter information is probably predicated and maybe critical to the process.
Well, along those same lines, I'd love to hear all three of y'all, and hopefully Sharif will jump in as well, because it's really a question for the folks that are part of his organization that are in those third world countries, and second world countries. But I know a number of the issues, at least in climate in the United States, has been around where some of the climate issues take place. I think about Detroit and the water. I grew up in Warrenton, which is the home of the environmental racism movement, and all in that space, because that's where the dump took place. And a lot of people were saying that the dump took place because it was a poorer area and a less protected area, both in terms of minorities and in terms of socioeconomic status, and all in that space. So do we run into that same problem? And I don't know the answer in other parts of the world where the companies are taking advantage of the poor people.
For a long time, we've been dumping our trash in emerging countries at large. And to say we, it's not just the United States. It's pretty much global. So that has more to do with pollution per se than climate change, though in some cases the two can be somewhat connected, because a lot of pollution is plastics. And plastics comes from the petrochemical market, which of course is a large contributor to adverse climate change. So the best step to fix that is to stop creating a lot of this one-use stuff, which can't be recycled and fills up landfills. But just at the very least, for instance, the vulcanized rubber used in tires, for instance, you really can't. I mean, you can sort of use tires chopped up as insulation, but it really hasn't been all that popular. The best path is to come up with another material, which Goodyear is doing, and other tire companies are as well. That is biodegradable, that can be recycled, and when it's put into a landfill, doesn't have a half-life of 1,000 years or whatever. So the coming up with better ways to do things, getting away from single-use products. You can go from plastic straws to metal straws and reuse them and wash them. Those little things can make a difference. But again, that's mostly with regard to pollution. But if we got off plastics, I think we would have a shorter path to getting off of the other petrochemical products, including gasoline, and because you start removing the economics from it. And once you remove the economics from something, it should naturally collapse. And our big issues, of course, with petrochemicals market is we still, at least here in the United States, we still subsidize it, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. So fixing some of those underlying problems would be extremely beneficial.
Hey, David, I got a quick question for you as well. I'm going to toss it back to you as well again. But it's about 100 degrees here in Durham, North Carolina, and everything, at least it feels like 100 degrees. And I know other parts of the world, including Texas, are very hot as well. So as we're talking about the climate, are we going to have to just deal with 100-degree temperatures and deal with this heat for a while? Or are there things that we can do to change the climate and make the climate better? Or are we just going to be like with my nephews, like I said, I don't have any kids of my own, but when my nephews who are now 14 or 15 are closer to my age and in their 60s and their 80s, will they be dealing with 105-degree temperatures and maybe living in a bubble of some sort in order to protect themselves because the weather is getting crazily hot? Maybe that's a little bit too radical, but in terms of the prediction model. But I was just wondering, is this something we need to be fearful of and all in that space? Because I'm hoping that they don't have to live living in 150-degree temperatures. But like I said, it's a hot day today. It's summer, so you expect it to be hot, but it does feel like it's been more blisteringly hot than in the past.
Well, town has good building codes that allow filtering. There's something called the constant public line, and it's 60 degrees all the time, about 6 feet under the ground. So if you can tie into that constant line, which a lot of new houses will actually put like a grid of heat transfer piping, and then you can actually use that cooling load and offload to heat and cool residential spaces, because that's actually, David, I think we're getting a little bit of background noise on your mic there. It's coming through. Thanks. So yeah, if your building codes allow you to build down and take on that constant temperature line, that could eliminate like 70% of our energy footprint we would put for residential heating and cooling. I was just watching a great documentary. It's free on YouTube called "Sex, Drugs, and Bicycles." It's about the Netherlands, and I really recommend watching it. But the Netherlands converted from coal to natural gas heat in just 1 decade. So it's kind of a prove a whole society or community sets their mind to doing something that's needed to be done. You can make real social change like that in a fairly short time. That's not the best progress, but don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. If you can get good enough incremental change, doing. But yeah, I would say there was that book With Enough Shovel. The guy wrote saying we could survive nuclear war if we just dig a thing and put a door over it and throw some dirt on top of the door. We might find ourselves doing stuff like that to get out of because it's we're into the adaptation phase. We've passed the mitigation phase. There's baked into the cake how much atmospheric insulation gas there is now. So we're going to have to start adapting to things like heat events. Which I'm sorry.
Sounds like it, David. It's 109. We're in Texas, so
tell us about 109 here yesterday. I just have to help y'all kind of even up on this. I mean, but don't think of just extreme heat. I mean, a couple of years ago here, we had such extreme cold that was not in the last 150 years of history for Texas too, where everything froze. We had more days of freezing, more snow than in the last 150 years. So it's extreme weather events is really what I think you're talking about. And it's just the differences. It's like in the summer, above 100 is not unusual here, just like it's not unusual in Arizona and other places like that. But then you read the headline out of New York City where they had 6 people die, and the high temperatures were in the mid 70s. And you go, wow, if that's a heat problem there, what is it? And it's part of it's the culture. Part of it is what you have around you, and how you adapt to it. So in Texas, we build our buildings, we build our power plants and everything for the heat. So when we had that 150-year cold event, they couldn't handle it. And I mean, I was without electricity for over a week, which was hard to handle. I now have a generator at the house for events like that. But you see those things are happening, and again, we always have the challenges of what we see right now, but we also have to understand it's cyclical, and that we're going to have more extreme weather with the climate changes because some of the buffers we had to help mediate shifts are not as strong as they used to be. But we're seeing that fixed. For example, for decades we heard about the hole in the ozone above the poles. Well, those are closing up and are almost closed now. So things are happening, but it's a constant cycle, a constant state of change. If everything was all the same all the time, God, that would be boring. So you kind of see that. I mean, for example, I love getting away this weekend and going to the lake and laying in the water and being out there in a totally different environment away from concrete and asphalt, which really reflects heat, stores heat and reflects heat, and taking myself way out and just going out there while it was still hot. It lowered my perception of heat tremendously. And that's part of what it is. It's what you do. But Mark, 109 here, supposed to be 109, 110 today. Feels like 125 is what the forecasters say. And so, no, I'm not going to go outside and go jogging this afternoon.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I was talking to a friend of mine. They were going jogging later on this morning here in North Carolina because of the weather being what it is. And like I said, it's 92 and might feel like 100 and something. And part of that is I was actually talking to a gentleman yesterday in the apartment complex that I'm with, and he was actually agreeing that he would prefer our temperatures versus where he was originally from, because he's from your neck of the woods. Because he, as he put it, he was from Houston, and it was 20 degrees hotter and 20% more humidity. So if you're going to put it that way, then yes, it is probably more oppressive in that sense if you are going to be at versus 100, 120, and then you add the fact that, yeah, we have humidity, but they also had 20% more humidity. So like you just said, it probably felt like 135. So it's a matter of whether you want to be in 100-degree temperature or 135. Me personally, I'd like some 70s, but that's just me being a little bit greedy, and I think Rob and Reverend Daniel would like some 70s as well. But I could be wrong. They might like the hot temperatures and all, but I'm thinking like 70s is the temperatures that I prefer, because I'm not a big fan of the overly cold either, even though I did go to a university that was there in Milwaukee. But give me some 70s and maybe some 60s, and I'll take some low 80s, but definitely the 70s would be wonderful.
But Rob lives far enough north that he's kind of insulated from part of this.
I'm telling you, this is God for us not going metric. Oh, go ahead, Rob. Where do you live?
Yeah, I'm up in Bend, Oregon. It should be in the high 80s today. But it tends to be quite a bit milder than it is in California generally.
Yep. Hey, speaking of which, I know the conversation was around global climate leaders, and I guess one of the frustrations I have is that our politicians, whether they are global or national or even sometimes local, are good at talking about the issues during the campaign trail time, but then they don't really do that good of a job in terms of enacting. That's just been my observation of some of our politicians and everything. But any take on that, Rob?
Yeah, so with regard to politics, you have to understand the dynamic. If you don't do anything, nobody can blame you for something you did. Politics is often as much about avoiding blame as it is about doing anything else. Your accomplishments can come back to haunt you. So promises are easy, but as soon as you do something, you're going to piss off a bunch of people that don't want it done. Or if it's done poorly, that's going to come back and land on you as well. It's funny, though. I see, not in politics. I remember when I was working at IBM, I had a third line manager come in, and he's shaking his head at me. He says, you volunteered for something again. The way you advance in a large company is you don't make commitments, and that way nobody can hold those commitments against you. As soon as you make a commitment, you're exposed. And he was a third line manager, and his entire department never, as far as I could tell, never did anything. I mean, absolutely never did anything. And it really drove me to start an initiative inside the company to get rid of people like him. But the fact of the matter, that's the reality is politicians are often incented not to accomplish anything. It's perfectly all right to try to accomplish something and not get it done, because you can blame that on the other party. But as soon as you're successful, you're exposed, and so a lot of the experienced politicians are, it's a very self-serving policy. Really have instituted a practice of really not getting involved in anything where they could actually get it done, but more likely get involved in something that looks very popular and where you can point at the other guy by saying that it's their fault it didn't get done, and in which case you're good because nobody's pissed off at you because you did something. And a lot of people are pissed off the other guy because they didn't do something. It's an unfortunate reality, I think, in politics. But it passes over into large corporations as well, sadly.
And that might be almost a psychological side. It seems like the bad things you do are 100 times more than the good things you do. Maybe.
Oh yeah, negatives kill you. The one little. I mean, remember with Hillary Clinton here running for president, her email servers just completely torched her, and nothing to do with practice. And you can even see how she came to the conclusion to do that damn thing. But but yeah, one mistake that tracks back to you, you're gonna be in deep crap. So it does promote an attitude of really not trying to get things done, and it's often fun to watch some of the young politicians come in, and same thing in a large company. Watch some of the young executives come in, and they're hell bent for leather to drive change, and it just pretty much drives them right out of the company because everybody lines up against whatever change they're trying to drive. It's unfortunate. It shouldn't be that way. When I was in internal audit in IBM, I went hunting for people that behaved in that fashion. I was somewhat successful. I wish I'd been more successful, but the people that behave that way, I think, really destroy the planet and destroy companies and governments. But they're extremely prevalent.
Yeah, they're definitely prevalent. Hopefully, Sharif's going to come in shortly and interrupt us and bring the show to a close. But you brought up a video.
I've got
I was actually looking up the video and all along those lines. But as we're waiting for Sharif to come back, what were some of the things? Because I've heard great things about NVIDIA as a company. But if you can give us a synopsis of what this leader was saying and everything about climate change leadership.
Yeah, I can do that. So he was at the Eve conference keynote talking about climate change, and the underlying effort is Earth 2, and he was talking about the fact that they're getting to the point where they're able to model a good chunk of the planet now with regard to weather patterns. The belief is if we can create Earth 2 as an accurate simulation of the planet, then we can do a much better job of evaluating large-scale climate mitigation technologies, whether we're talking about blocking the sun or introducing iron into the ocean. Or there are a number of these large-scale projects that are being considered. And the danger for large-scale projects, global projects, is there unintended or consequential damages, and the unintended outcomes are consequential damages. And the modeling with Earth 2 should allow us to see, once it's complete, should allow us to see what those unintended consequences and consequential damages might be, and that would allow us to better assess whether we want to use that particular technology to fix the problem. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to introduce something at a global scale and suddenly say, "Oh yeah, look at this! It just made things worse. We just wiped out all the fish in the ocean, or it just made things worse." Suddenly, a lot of the planet is not able to produce food, or it just made things worse. All of a sudden, we've gone from a global heating event to a new ice age. Any of those things are possible with a number of these global efforts. And so, Earth 2 is designed to mitigate the secondary impacts, or at least allow us to understand the secondary effects of some of these global programs, and make an informed decision of whether the risks are worth the rewards. We so often do things without really understanding what the outcome's going to be. It's going to be really good to have some type of a global simulator that will allow us to at least assess the damage before we do it.
Hey, Rob, do you have a favorite data standard for all these digital twin projects? I know there's a few that are jumping up.
Well, I'm a big fan of NVIDIA's Omniverse only because it's been well established, and it's the one that I know that's in greatest use. It currently is being used by most of the large manufacturing firms. It's every automotive company has now picked up the automotive version, the automotive version of Omniverse, and it's being used to train the majority of autonomous cars now. So right now, it's the one that's in most use. And for me, if you're going to create an environment with digital twins and a true metaverse, then you want to pick something people are using. We certainly saw with the Zuckerberg metaverse, I think they got up to, I think it was $698, $700 in revenue coming from their $2.53 billion investment, which was clearly a catastrophic failure. So right now, but we're still early on in these metaverse efforts and digital twins. And so that there are opportunities for other people to enter. But right now, NVIDIA's Omniverse is really the only game that has reached, at least to my knowledge, has reached global coverage with the major firms. And of course, it's at the heart of the Earth 2 effort as well.
What about JSON as a data standard between these projects? Is that JSON, JavaScript on Java? Is that something that's kind of something to default for ways to share data?
As far as interop and platform, yeah. But if you're only dealing with one environment, what are you interoperating with? So So yeah, there are a lot of languages that we could use to create links with other metaverse elements. The problem we've got is we don't really have a lot of other metaverse elements to connect to yet. But yes, open, regardless how we get there, using some type of an open standard, open source platform, language to do this would be incredibly beneficial. And that's where the market is right now, with the exceptions of companies like Apple, who is still highly proprietary, and there are a few others out there like that. Most everybody else in the software environment has come around to the idea of using, open tools, maintaining transparency. Particularly as we move into artificial intelligence, we've got to be able to go in and diagnose these things so we understand if they make mistakes, why and how they made them, so we can mitigate them. And if everything's proprietary, it's very hard to do that.
Do you like OpenStreetMaps for the map part? Or
yeah, it's about the idea of OpenStreetMaps in terms of being able Open's good. The issue, of course, with Open is it does open the door to contamination by third parties. But I'm still of the view that Open's better than not, and once you understand the risks, I believe you can mitigate them. It's better than going the proprietary route. Because the problem is with the proprietary route, if it does get compromised, you might not notice the compromise until far too late. Where at least if stuff's open, you've got a lot of eyes on it, and a much better chance that somebody's going to notice at least in my view, going to notice the compromise if it occurs. There are advantages to being proprietary in areas that need to be extremely secure. But in this case, where you're using a mapping technology where a lot of people are going to rely on it, and a lot of people are going to have access to it, then Open is probably better long-term than going down a proprietary route.
Like Google Earth, I guess, is the leader in this closed system.
Yeah, Google Earth is kind of they've done an awful lot of work with regard to mapping. So far it hasn't been us too hard, though. I do remember the number of people that have driven off into the ocean using mapping, and that poor couple that drove into the wrong area. In fact, the entire family that drove into the wrong area in Brazil, and they all got killed. So there are issues with any mapping technology, I guess is what I'm saying. And you still have to make sure you're going where you want to go.
No, it's off the topic and waiting. Hopefully Sharif is listening and will pop back in any moment. But
because I got to leave.
We're off the topic and everything. What are your thoughts about Threads? Because I know that's the different off of
Threads.
But
yeah, so Threads is kind of we're way off topic now, but Threads is kind of fascinating. I mean, okay, my wife's telling me she's waiting for me in the car. So after I'm done with this little thing, I'm going to have to run because making her angry the day after my anniversary would not be a wise.
That's not a good thing to do, and I'm not trying to encourage that.
So anyways, so Threads. So what happened with Threads was Zuckerberg pretty much pissed off advertisers and users with Twitter to a degree that is almost unbelievable, but they didn't have a place to go. Mastodon was probably the closest thing they had to try, but Mastodon's kind of it's just a pain to use. It's technically very competent. The back end is awesome, but the user interface just kind of sucked. And so what Zuckerberg did is he created a new user interface for Mastodon. His back end is Mastodon, with Threads. And so and if you've used it, and I've used it now, it's like old Twitter. It's Twitter without a lot of the enhancements that came later. Right now, those enhancements will be added, but the reason to do it initially without a lot of the enhancements is you've got to be able to tolerate loading. And he had no idea how popular this was going to be. And as you saw, it's jumped within just a matter of days to 100 million users. It has wiped out even the Chat GPT ramp in terms of how fast people got on that platform. And it has a very real likelihood of passing Twitter by the end of the quarter. And so it's been incredibly disruptive. The other part that made this interesting is Musk challenged Zuckerberg to a cage match. And you would have thought Zuckerberg would have said no, but I think Zuckerberg recognized that if he said yes, that Musk would focus on the cage match and not focus on a competitive response to Threads, and which is exactly what happened. And so Threads hit in what was a vacuum with Twitter. Twitter finally spun around and has issued a cease and desist order, which will do nothing, and it started a certain amount of criticism and trying some social pushback, implying that some cases Threads is somehow connected to Satan and a bunch of there's some bizarre stuff coming out. So that to try to block it, all unsuccessful so far. And so this is kind of like a perfect storm for Zuckerberg to walk in and step through. And even with regard to the cage match, it was kind of odd because Zuckerberg's been working and he's belted and ranked now and in martial arts. Musk is not. And if you see pictures of Zuckerberg, he's ripped. Musk looks like a doughboy. And if they actually do this cage match,
yeah, it's not going to be pretty. Zuckerberg's going to take them. It's not going to be.
Then I got to go because my wife's waiting for me and I don't want to get killed. So I'll see you guys next time.
I'm all for maintaining peace and harmony within families. So please get to that car. Please get to that safety and do good things. I even apologize to the wife for me and Reverend Daniel holding you up and everything. So definitely you take the brunt of the blame.
You got it. Take care. Bye-bye.
Well, wife long and prosper.
Yes. Exactly. You had mentioned this quote and everything, so we're still waiting for Sharif to pop back and wrap us up and all along those lines. But you had mentioned this quote from Werner Heisenberg. So what did this quote have to do about science progresses our funeral at a time? So I was going like, that's an interesting quote.
Science progresses one funeral at a time. Yeah, it's Heisenberg was a famous quantum physicist in the core group with people like Einstein and Bohr, and he said basically these old guys have to die for their models to be allowed to go away and the new models to come and replace them, because there is all this. I was in a group yesterday. I was running with the Transhumanist Party, and they said, "Well, science, that seems like it's awfully kind of corrupt right now." And I'm like, there is a lot of insider academic kind of nepotism in the scientific world. World projects get funded by the same people, and that science progresses one for time issue. People don't want it. I could say something about. It's a kind of a long story, but we just switched elections to 5 districts in Thousand Oaks elections. Mm-hmm. And the map that was overwhelming would have had 2 incumbent city council people running against each other, and no one. It would have been a vacant, and threw that map away faster than you could imagine. The people in the audience were like shame, because it was obvious what they were protecting their own little power center.
They were being power hungry.
It's going to be me because I'm a candidate, ran 3 times before. Basically not spending any money, but you only have to talk to 25,000 voters instead of 125,000 voters. So it's going to be
the math is working better in your favor. That's always a good thing.
Yeah, and neighborhood councils. That's kind of what this humane account union initiative that I'm proposing is going to be like little groups of 150 people that get together and figure stuff out based on provable evidence and citizen science. I guess they're calling it community science, or they don't want to more non-citizens from doing stuff. The new more correct term is community science, not citizen science, because you don't want to scare people away.
Yeah, definitely. So we're just waiting for our fearless leader. Everybody else is departed. We've brought up the notion of climate change and climate leadership. So we're just waiting for Sharif to pop in and tell us about how this is going all over the world and all in that space. But who knows what Sharif is doing over there in Bangladesh. He might be teaching a course, or he might be doing something else, but we'll figure out what he's got going on, because I know I've got to get to some other stuff.
Yeah, there is a lot of solar weather hitting the Earth right in the maximum flare event, and I think it's the M class. But hey, here's Sharif.
There's Sharif. How's it going, Sharif? We're having the whole dialogue without you and everything, but I was just letting you know that we were wrapping up and all along those lines, but we were definitely figuring out what we could do about leadership and all in that space. But hopefully your listeners and your students got something out of this dialogue, not just between me and Reverend Daniel, but also with Rob and David as well. So hopefully they got something out of this conversation, and we'll continue these conversations on a regular basis. But we're tossing it to you now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. I request all of our audience, please share our content as much as possible. Thank you, bye-bye, and take care.